Okay, so brain development. Let's take a quick look at that. You'll have this beautiful image in front of you of the brain. Now, what we really want to highlight is what it says at the bottom of this photo, and that is that at one time that this was considered a crucial time in young children's development, where they felt that the brain, this was the time and the only time really to truly build those synapses and those connections within the brain. And what studies are now saying is that it's a bit more pliable than what we thought. So we're now calling it a sensitive period, whereas it's still extremely important between 0 and 6 years of age to build these connections within the brain, these pathways. But we can do some modifications. We can support children later on in life a little bit more, but it's going to be a lot harder. So what this tells me is let's do it right the first time. So that brain, we're going to look at that red part of the brain that sits on the frontal part, and that's why it's called our frontal lobe. And this part of our brain, it develops between birth to 6 years of age. This is where in the brain that we learn to regulate our impulses. We make some decision making. It's where we do our logic and our reasoning, our sound judgment, decision making. It's where we get some social understanding that helps us to determine when we should and shouldn't do or say things. Where we get that filter. It's where we engage in some executive functions. It's where we have self-control, our attention span, and our working memory. Now, within this frontal lobe is also what they call our prefrontal cortex. And did you know this is the last part of our brain to actually even finish maturing? This astounded me. I didn't even realize this because you know what? I should have done this first. I'm not a brain scientist. I am not an expert of the brain. I'm not an expert around trauma-informed practices. But I have done a lot of research and I have gone to a lot of workshops and I've done a lot of training around this. And what I have found was staggering. Doesn't start to develop between the ages of 3 and doesn't finish maturing until 22 to 25 years of age. And then I stopped and I thought, how many 2-year-olds have I wondered, why do they not show empathy when they bite? Why are these 3-year-olds not understanding that snatching a toy and smacking a friend across the back of the head is unacceptable? We've talked about it so many times. It's because that brain isn't there yet. It's somewhat similar to the brakes of a car, that frontal cortex. When we have these moments of frustration and impulse behavior, the brakes haven't yet developed, so they're not able to put on the brakes to those impulses. When you as an adult get frustrated and you're really wanting to just lay into somebody because what they've said is just so wrong or just so goes against everything you believe, and you want to come back with some comment, but you stop in that split second, you make a decision, you know what, that would be disrespectful. That's uncalled for, Janine. That's not professional. That's not caring. Stop and think. You're going to get yourself into trouble. In those split seconds that I've made that decision, that is actually my prefrontal cortex at work. So thank you, brain. Thank you. You've done well today. But let's stop and think for a moment of that scenario, but in an early learning center in regards to children's behaviors. Do we allow them that right to still be building that part of their brain? It takes us that moment to think This is why it is so important to be fully engaged in children's learning. Do not be sitting on the edge of the sandpit or a rock off to the side waiting for something to happen, because it will. Because those children are still developing that part of the brain. Instead, jump in and be that part of the brain for them. That's our role in early learning. Now let's look at the temporal lobe. That is the part of the brain that is going to be helping us with hearing, learning, and emotions. It's also responsible for memory, and it's what's going to be relied on in moments of stress and trauma to give the proper emotional response. So what's happening is that within that temporal lobe is our limbic system, and there's the amygdala, and it feels a threat or some form of a challenge in that environment. And it's going to alert the hippocampus and ask the hippocampus, okay, buddy, how are you going to emotionally respond to this threat? The hippocampus goes, ooh, there's an alert, okay? Amygdala, what's going to happen is we are going to rely on our memory and our past learning to give us that emotional response. And that response is going to be either fight or flight. And that's those different parts of the brains, how they communicate and how they work together. Now, the temporal lobe, once again, is the part of the brain. It's developing between the ages of 0 and 6. And that is just a little bit about what your brain might be doing, especially in the sight of a child.